My mother promised to explain everything. She never expected me to verify it. The morning I found the envelope, my mother was humming in the kitchen. Low, tuneless content. I remember standing in the hallway outside her bedroom door. Before we continues, please subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps this powerful, life-changing story reach the world. The pale blue envelope balanced on my palm, wondering why my name was written on it in handwriting I had never seen before. Not hers. Not my father's. The return address was a town called Mire, 3 states away. I had never heard of it. I set the envelope back on her dresser exactly where I found it and walked to school with my pulse drumming behind my ears. I was 17 years old. I told myself it meant nothing. Plenty of letters arrived with strange handwriting. But I had seen the word daughter written below my name, underlined twice, and I could not unsee it. My mother's name was Clara Voss. My name was Nadia Voss. And my father, the man who had tucked me in, taught me to ride a bike and burn pancakes every Sunday, was Daniel Voss. That was the whole story. That was supposed to be the whole story. I just didn't know yet that my mother had been writing a different version for years, and that I was the part she had quietly edited out. I gave her 3 days before I asked. 3 days of watching her over dinner, studying her hands when she passed the salt, listening for any hesitation in her laugh. Clara Voss was a careful woman. She kept her hair pinned neatly, her words measured, her emotions folded away like linens. She had raised me to be the same. So when I sat across from her on a Thursday evening and said, "Mom, who sent me a letter from Mire Ford?" I watched her hands go still first. Then her face. The change was barely visible. A tightening around the eyes, a breath held 1 second too long. She set down her fork. She looked at me with an expression I had no name for then, though I would come to call it the look of someone who had been expecting a question for years and still wasn't ready when it arrived. "Where did you see that?" she asked. Her voice was steady. Too steady. I recognized steadiness used as armor because I had learned it from her. I knew, in the way you know things you wish you didn't, that the answer she was deciding how to give me was going to change everything. I just didn't know yet how much of everything there was to change. She didn't tell me that night. She said it was complicated and that she loved me and that nothing would change between us. She reached across the table and pressed both her hands over mine and looked at me with eyes that were starting to shine. I nodded. I told her I understood. I told her to take all the time she needed. But I was already lying because even as I sat there squeezing her hands back, I was planning how to find the truth on my own. My best friend Jonah had once helped me track down a stolen bicycle using only a serial number and 2 hours on a public database. He was the kind of person who believed any question had an answer if you knew where to look. By 9 o'clock I had texted him. I didn't explain everything. I told him I needed help finding who lived at a specific address in Mireford and whether there was any public record connecting them to my family. He replied within 2 minutes, "On it. Give me till tomorrow." I put my phone down. I listened to my mother humming again in the kitchen, that same tuneless sound, and I wondered how many times I had heard it without understanding what it was covering. Jonah met me the next morning before first period, his laptop tucked under his arm. He steered me to a corner of the library and opened the screen between us. The address in Mireford belonged to a man named Robert Hale. 61 years old. Retired schoolteacher. There was a public obituary for a woman named Susan Hale, his wife who had passed 4 years earlier, and a mention in a local church newsletter listing Robert Hale as the proud father of 2 daughters. Jonah looked at me. I looked at the screen. The newsletter was dated 12 years ago. It said, Robert Hale joined by his daughters, Miriam age 20 and Nadia age 5. I was 5 years old 12 years ago. I had never met anyone named Robert Hale. I read the line twice. I read it a third time. My hands were shaking by the time I closed the laptop. Jonah didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Do you want me to keep looking?" I told him yes. The library was filling up around us with ordinary morning noise. Backpacks dropped on tables, chairs scraping, lockers slamming in the hall outside, and none of it sounded real anymore. Daniel Voss married Clara in June 19 years ago. That much was printed inside their wedding album on the living room shelf. What I didn't know, and what Jonah found through a public marriage registry, was that Clara had been married once before. Briefly. At 22 to a man named Robert James Hale. The marriage lasted 14 months. The divorce was finalized in a county courthouse in Mire. I sat with that information for a long time. My mother had been married before. That alone wasn't devastating. People had lives before their children arrived. But Robert Hale had called me his daughter. He had written my name on an envelope, underlined the word daughter twice, and mailed it to our house in Cedar Falls. He hadn't written to Clara. He had written to me. Which meant he believed I was his. And if he was right, then Daniel Voss, the man who burned pancakes every Sunday, was not my biological father at all. I went home that evening and watched Daniel grill chicken in the backyard with his sleeves rolled up, relaxed and unsuspecting, and I felt something go cold and quiet inside me, like a lamp turning off in an empty room. He came to me that Sunday with the posture of someone bracing for impact. She sat on the edge of my bed and told me a version of the story. She had been young when she married Robert. The marriage was a mistake and she left before she knew. She paused here, before she knew she was pregnant. By the time she found out, she was already rebuilding her life in Cedar Falls. She had met Daniel. She had made a decision. She believed it was the right one. Robert had agreed to stay away. She was sorry she hadn't told me sooner. She reached for my hand. This time I didn't squeeze back. Because her version had 3 clean edges and 1 ragged one, and I already knew which part she was leaving out. She had not mentioned the letter once. In her entire account of the past, the decision, the silence, she said nothing about Robert reaching out now 17 years later. Nothing about what he wanted. Nothing about the pale blue envelope she had left sitting on her dresser. She spoke entirely in the past tense, as though the story were finished. As though a letter in present tense had not arrived in our mailbox 12 days ago, addressed to me. That night, after she left my room with a relieved look that told me she thought the hard part was over, I retrieved the envelope from her dresser. I opened it. The handwriting inside was careful and unhurried. Robert Hale wrote that he wasn't trying to disrupt my life. His wife had passed away and his older daughter had moved abroad. He was 61, in moderate health, and simply wanted, before much more time passed, for me to know that I existed to him. He said my mother knew he was writing. He closed with his phone number. I read that. Second to last line 4 times. My mother knew he was writing. She had known the letter was coming and said nothing until I confronted her. Even then she had described the past without touching the present at all. She had been managing information. Deciding the shape of my own story for me the way she always had, the way I now understood she had been doing my entire life. I was furious in the quiet way that doesn't break things. I didn't yell. I went to school Monday morning and copied notes in my usual handwriting. But something beneath the surface had shifted, the way a riverbed shifts without disturbing the water above. I called Robert on a Tuesday from the park 2 blocks from our house, sitting on the cold iron bench near the fountain that was turned off for winter. The phone rang 3 times. Then a man's voice answered, measured, slightly rough, the voice of someone who had once been a teacher and still shaped his words with care. I told him my name. There was a pause. Then he said, Nadia. Not as a question. As something he had rehearsed saying for a long time and was finally allowed to say aloud. We talked for 47 minutes. He didn't rush or make demands. He told me about Mire, about the school where he'd taught English for 30 years, about Susan who loved gardening and died of a brain aneurysm at 57. He told me about my half-sister Miriam living in Portugal who didn't know I existed. He said he had kept Clara's secret for 17 years because she had asked him to. But he was older now and something in him needed to reach out before it was too late. I listened to all of it. When he finished, I asked the only question that actually mattered. I said, "Are you sure?" He said he was sure. After the divorce, Clara had contacted him once, 8 months later, to say she was pregnant and that the child wasn't his. He had accepted it. He had grieved quietly and moved forward. But 4 years ago, while Susan was in the hospital, he had started putting old things in order. He found a photograph Clara had sent just after the divorce. She was visibly pregnant. He noted the timing. He did the math. He sat with that calculation for 4 years before he finally wrote the letter. He wasn't certain in the way a DNA test is certain. He was certain the way a person is when every piece of information points in one direction. I told him I needed more than that. He said he understood. A voluntary paternity test required only a cheek swab mailed to a certified lab. He gave me the lab name and said he would cover the cost. I told him I would think about it. I walked home with the cold air pressing against my face and tried to understand that the man I had just spoken to for 47 minutes believed he was my father, and that I had nothing yet that proved he was wrong. The hardest part of the next 2 weeks was pretending. I was pretending with my mother, who moved around the house with the careful relief of someone who believed the storm had passed. I was pretending with Daniel, who came home that weekend and grilled chicken in the backyard and told me about a bridge he was engineering in the next county. He looked at me the way he always had, with that steady, unshakable attention that had always made me feel like the ground was solid. I watched him from the patio chair and tried to understand what I was doing. If the test confirmed what Robert believed, then Daniel's steadiness was built on a truth he didn't know was incomplete. He had raised me on a belief my mother had given him without his knowledge. I thought about what that made her. I pressed the thought the way you press a bruise, not because it feels good but to understand how deep the damage goes. I ordered the test kit and had it sent to Jonah's address. I told Jonah everything. He sat very still while I explained. Then he said, "You know this changes things no matter what the result is, right?" I said I knew. I mailed the swab the following morning. The results took 11 days. 11 days of ordinary life laid over an extraordinary question. I went to school. I got a B+ on my chemistry exam. I ate dinner with my mother every night and watched her refill my water glass without being asked. That small, habitual love I had never consciously noticed and now could not stop seeing. I wondered what she would do if she knew what I had done. Whether she would be angry, frightened, or quietly relieved that the decision had been taken out of her hands. Daniel still texted me links to articles he thought I'd find interesting. Marine chemistry one evening, bridge engineering the next. He didn't know anything had changed. That was the part one found hardest to sit with. On the 11th night I got an email from the lab. I was at my desk with homework open in front of me. I stared at the subject line for a full minute. Then I clicked it. The result was stated in careful clinical language. The kind labs use to deliver information they know will change a person's life. The probability of paternity, it said, was 99.97%. Robert James Hale was my biological father. I didn't cry. I think I had already done the crying in small increments during the 11 days of waiting, distributed between homework and dinner so that no one would notice. What I felt when I read the result was stranger than grief. It was the sensation of a puzzle clicking into place. That quiet, irrevocable sound of things becoming true that were always true whether you knew it or not. I forwarded the result to Robert. He replied within an hour. "Thank you for doing this. I'm not going anywhere and I'm not asking for anything you don't want to give. Take your time." I saved his reply to a folder labeled with his initials and closed my laptop. Jonah texted to check on me. I told him the result. He sent back one word, "Damn," and then "I'm here." I was glad he didn't try to say more. Some things don't need more than that. I went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table across from my mother, who was grading papers from her adult literacy class, her reading glasses low on her nose. She looked comfortable. She looked unbothered. She looked like a woman who believed the hard conversation was behind her. I waited for her to look up. When she looked up, she smiled. That was the worst part. The automatic, uncomplicated smile she gave me 100 times a day, the smile of a woman who believed the distance between us had been repaired. It dissolved layer by layer like ice thawing as I spoke. I told her everything, the call, the test, the result. I didn't raise my voice. I had rehearsed this conversation enough times to know its edges, and I stayed inside them. She listened without interrupting. By the time I finished, her hands were flat on the table. She was very still. Her eyes held something I couldn't classify between guilt and grief and exhausted relief. All three perhaps arriving at once. She said, "I should have told you years ago." I said, "Yes." She said, "I was afraid of what it would do to your father." She meant Daniel. I noticed the word she used, your father. I did not correct her. But I held the word in my mind and turned it over slowly, examining it the way you examine something you are not yet sure how to name, understanding that whatever name I eventually gave it would be one I had chosen for myself, not one handed down to me. What followed was not a single conversation but many, spread across weeks. The way a wound is not treated once but returned to again and again. My mother told me the full version gradually, piece by piece. And Robert had married young and badly. They wanted incompatible futures. He wanted to leave Mire. He was rooted there. The marriage cracked until it gave way. She moved to Cedar Falls. She met Daniel at a work conference 6 weeks later and felt for the first time in years like she could breathe. When she realized she was pregnant, she was 8 weeks along. He did the math. He was almost certain Robert was the father. But she was also almost certain she wanted a life with Daniel. So she made a choice. He told Daniel the baby was his. He had no reason to doubt her. She told Robert the child wasn't his. He had no evidence to dispute her. She closed the space between those two decisions and built a life inside it. For 17 years the life had held. She didn't ask me to understand. She said she had told herself so many times that she'd done what was best for me. She was no longer certain that was true. Daniel found out on a Saturday. Not from me, I want to be clear about that. My mother made the choice herself. She came to me Friday night and said it wasn't right for me to carry the secret, that she was the one who had made the choices and needed to own them. I said okay. She asked if I wanted to be there when she told him. I said no. So on Saturday morning, while I sat in Jonah's kitchen pretending to work on a history essay, my mother told Daniel the truth. Jonah kept refilling my tea without comment. At noon my phone rang. Daniel's voice was very flat. He asked if I had known. I said I had found out recently. He asked if I was okay. I said I thought so. He said he needed some time and would call when he was ready. Then he said something I want to remember exactly. This doesn't change who you are to me. I just need to understand who I am in this. Okay. I said okay. We hung up. I put my phone face down on Jonah's kitchen table and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft, indifferent, covering everything equally. Daniel took 11 days. He stayed at a hotel for the first 4, then moved to his brother Marcus's house across town. He texted me twice during that time. Once to say he was okay, once to ask about a school project I'd mentioned weeks earlier, which told me he had been paying attention even through this. On the 11th day he came home. He and my mother talked for a long time in the kitchen with the door closed. I sat upstairs with headphones in, music off, listening to the low murmur of their voices. When the talking stopped, he knocked on my door. He looked like someone who had been carefully disassembled and put back together. The same pieces but with visible seams. He sat in the chair by my window. We actually talked for the first time in weeks. He said he wasn't angry at me. He was still working through what he felt about my mother. But he kept coming back to one thing. He had been a father to me for 17 years and that was real, and no document from a laboratory could reach back through time and unmake it. I told him it was real to me too. We didn't hug. We just sat together until the light changed. Robert Hale called me again in the 3rd week of November. We had exchanged careful, polite messages since the result, circling each other like two people in a doorway, both trying to be courteous. On the call he asked if I would consider meeting him. He said it was completely my choice and he would not push. He had said that in every communication and I had noted how consistently he kept the promise. I asked him to give me a month. He said of course. I spent that month asking myself what I actually wanted. Not what was fair, not what my mother or Daniel deserved, not what Robert needed, but what Nadia Voss needed. I found slowly and then all at once that I wanted to meet him. Not to replace anything. Not to punish my mother or validate Robert's patience. Just to see his face. Just to sit in the same room as the man who had written my name in careful handwriting, underlined the word daughter twice, and waited 17 years to see if I would come. I thought I owed that much, not to him necessarily but to myself. I called him back on a Friday evening and said I would come in December. I told my mother I was going to Mire. It was a Thursday evening at the kitchen table where most of the significant conversations of the past 2 months had taken place. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, okay. Just that one word. I think she had been waiting for it the same way she had been waiting for me to find the letter. Braced and resigned, and underneath both those things, perhaps a little relieved that the next step was being taken. She didn't cry. She asked if I wanted her to drive me. I said no, I'd asked Daniel. She nodded. Something existed between us in that moment that I didn't have a name for yet. Not closeness and not distance, but a new kind of seeing. The kind that arrives when you finally observe another person clearly, flaws and all, and understand that clarity doesn't automatically dissolve love. I still loved her. I was still angry. Those two things coexisted in me without canceling each other out, and I was beginning to accept that they might continue to do so for a very long time. I left her at the table and went upstairs to pack a small bag for the next morning. Daniel drove me to Mire on a Saturday in early December. We left before dawn. He brought a thermos of coffee, a bag of almonds, and a playlist of old road trip songs he'd apparently made just for the drive. We didn't talk about Robert. We didn't talk about my mother or the letter or the test. We talked about the bridge he was engineering and my history essay and a documentary about deep-sea fish we'd both separately watched. We talked the way we always had, easily, without effort, the way people do when they have years of practice and genuine interest in each other. About 3 hours in, somewhere past a town called Galloway, he said, "I want you to know I think you're doing the right thing. Going." I said, "Even though it's complicated?" He said, "Especially because it's complicated. Easy things don't usually need courage." I looked out the window at the pale winter fields and thought about that for a long time. Then I asked if he was okay. He said, "Getting there." It was the most honest answer I'd heard from anyone in months, and I found it strangely comforting. We drove on. The sky brightened slowly ahead of us, pink along the horizon, like something beginning. Robert Hale lived in a white house on a quiet street. There was a dormant garden along one side, bare-stemmed rose bushes in neat rows that would bloom again in spring. His front door was painted a deep blue-green, the color of still water. I noticed these details with an intensity one recognized as the brain deliberately making memories. Daniel stayed in the car. We had agreed on that. I walked to the door alone and knocked. Then the door opened. Robert was tall and broad-shouldered, with gray at his temples and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He wore a green flannel shirt and looked exactly as a retired English teacher from a small town should look. Careful, kind, slightly formal, as though he had been choosing his words since morning. He looked at my face. I looked at his. There was a moment of absolute silence between us. And then I understood why the church newsletter had listed my name alongside Miriam's with such certainty, because when I looked at Robert Hale I saw the precise architecture of my own nose, the same deep-set quality around the eyes. A jawline I had always assumed came from some distant Voss relative. It had not come from the Weisses. It had been here all along. We sat in his living room for 2 hours. He made tea. He showed me photographs, deliberate choices, not an overwhelming flood. A photo of Susan in her garden, laughing, hands full of soil. A photo of Miriam at university graduation, dark-haired and serious in her gown. A photo of Robert himself as a young man, standing outside the school where he had taught for 30 years. I studied that young face. The resemblance was almost architectural. I told him I could see it. He said he had seen it too in the photograph Clara had sent after the divorce. We talked about ordinary things alongside the heavier ones. He asked about school. I told him I liked chemistry and creative writing. Opposites that somehow both made sense to me. He said Miriam had been similar, science in school but literature in her heart. He offered the comparison gently, without pressure, the way you extend something fragile and wait to see if it is taken. I took it. I asked questions I had been holding for months. Not accusatory ones, just questions that needed answers. He answered each honestly, without flinching, without asking me to feel anything particular about what he said. I respected that more than I expected to. Before I left, Robert gave me a letter for Miriam. He had told her about me the previous week. He'd needed to, he said, so I wouldn't walk into another secret. He said she had taken it quietly and would write to me herself when ready. What he handed me was not a letter but a photograph. Himself and Miriam together at Christmas, standing in front of the blue-green door. Both older and grayer than their other photos. He said she had signed the back. I turned it over. In small, neat handwriting. "Nadia, I'm still learning what this means. But I'm glad you exist." I held that for a moment. Then I put it carefully in my jacket pocket. Robert walked me to the door. We stood on the step in the cold, uncertain about the geometry of goodbye. He offered his hand. I shook it. Then, without deciding to, I stepped forward and hugged him briefly, one arm quick like testing a temperature. He went very still. Then one hand came to my shoulder for a moment. We stepped apart. He said, "Drive safe." I said, "I will." I walked back to the car. Daniel looked up from his book. I said, "Let's go home." He started the engine. December passed. January arrived. Things did not return to normal. I had learned that in stories like this, normal doesn't come back. It makes room for a new version of itself. My mother and I had harder conversations, more honest ones. She told me things I hadn't asked about. The fear she had felt when I was born that I would look unmistakably like Robert. her relief when I didn't, or didn't seem to, not to anyone who wasn't looking closely. The way guilt had worked on her slowly over the years, like water on stone. She didn't ask me to forgive her. She said she would understand if I couldn't. But I found as January stretched into February, that forgiveness was not the wall I'd imagined. It was a door, and it didn't open all at once. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Afia Mensah, who had a plant on her windowsill and a way of asking questions that felt like handing you a flashlight rather than an answer. She helped me name things I'd been carrying in silence and understand that loving two versions of a parent, the one you believed in and the one you came to know, was not a contradiction. It was the complicated business of being a child. Daniel and my mother were still working things out between them slowly, the way two people who have built a life together must work through betrayal. Not all at once but in increments, deciding each day whether the life they built is worth tending. I stayed out of it. It wasn't mine to manage. But I watched them the way you watch weather, not directing it, just noting what it does. There were evenings when they talked quietly after dinner. There were days when my mother's eyes were red and Daniel's jaw was tight. But there were also mornings when they stood at the kitchen counter with their coffee and talked about ordinary things. The neighbor's dog, a news story, what to make for dinner. And those mornings told me something. Not that everything was fine. But that they were choosing each day to keep trying. I understood that kind of choosing. I was doing it myself. Choosing to answer my mother's questions honestly. Choosing to send Robert a short message when something reminded me of our conversation. Choosing to sit with Daniel on Sunday evenings and watch whatever documentary he'd queued up, even when things between us all still felt tender and not entirely resolved. In March, 6 months after I found the blue envelope on my mother's dresser, Miriam Hale emailed me from Lisbon. She had been thinking for weeks about how to begin. She wrote that she and I had the same father and completely different lives and found that strange and somehow wonderful. She asked if I'd be open to talking. No pressure, just if I wanted. I replied the same evening, yes. I told her one thing had been sitting with me since I read what she'd written on the back of the photograph, that she was still learning what it meant, this unexpected addition to a story she thought she knew. I told her I was too. Not arriving at it, not resolving it. Just learning slowly what it meant to be Nadia. Not only Nadia Voss, daughter of Clara and Daniel, girl from Cedar Falls, but Nadia who came from a white house with a blue-green door, from a man with careful handwriting and a dormant rose garden, from a woman who signed photographs with grace. My mother had promised to explain everything. She never expected me to verify it. But I had, and the truth, all of it, even the sharp-edged parts, had turned out to be something I could live inside.